Summer 920. It did not take long for Osrith to catch up with the Alba army. Smaller now in number, they had crossed the Tuide and were slowly making their way around the coast of what was once Bernicia under King Oswald. Osrith sensed that Sánid was keeping the army in sight of the fleet, still flying the Red Hand of the Allied with many smaller boats behind. He had kept as many as he could safe, had Domnall, Osrith thought to herself. Constantine's scheme, but he had not been there. That told to Edward, that told to Uhtred and to Aethelstan that, though big, the fight was not big enough for him to make his presence known himself. A family war. Even though he was acutely interested in the politics of anything that happened north of the Roman wall. They were close to Sánid's farm now when she got within sight of the generals, allowing their horses to drink in the shallows of Berwick's estuary. She could not see her husband however, but did see Eswy. Has he gone ahead, Osrith wanted to know, or home? Eswy got down from his horse as steadily as he could, and bade her get down too. Uhtred won, Osrith told him. Uhtred the Dane, my elder brother. And you came all this way to see it happen? I can see Bibbenberg from our farm, Osrith told him. That and the castle on Lindisfarne. I needed to know once and for all who would be my neighbor. She glanced west, and then a little south. All of Sánid's lands encircled the settlement of Berwick, green fields in autumn, brown in winter, and crops aplenty in spring and summer, high yields from the low-lying lands of the south. Sheep in the hills on the northern fall of land, cows in the valleys, fishing, untithed, to support the people, as had been done since the days of Bridi. Osrith had guilt to assuage. She just wanted to be with Sánid now. So? She asked, noticing Engus's eyes on her. Where is he? Osrith, Eswy said to her, hand on her shoulder. Do you not know? And when she did not answer, her comrade, her friend, continued. He was killed, in the fighting, on the beach. At Bibbenberg. Killed, Osrith repeated. It was just a word, then. It was a mechanism to deliver information. She did not feel its meaning. Killed. He fell, at the battle, Eswy told her, and now Engus was behind their temporary commander, and looked sorrowfully at Osrith. He fell defending two Strathclydians who were being backed into the cliff, Engus told him. He turned and fought both of them. They escaped and supported the mercenaries to gain entry at the front of the fortress by drawing the attack away. He was unlucky. Unlucky. Ill luck had killed Sánid, who she loved, and who she had spent poor time showing that she did. So, you will come back to Dunnottar with us, Eswy said, seeing her face. See your son? But Osrith said nothing. She was not going to Constantine, to Edu or young Finan. She was going home, back home, to her farm just beyond, to her farms and her fields. Osrith, Eswy called, scrambling back onto his horse and making to ride after her. But after a few horse hoofs into the flat of the river, Osrith was too far away to try to catch her. She was going home, to try to make sense of everything. 88,888,888 Berma, go and see who it is, Engus instructed one of their watchers. They were close to Dunnottar now, the fourth estuary before them. But, like riding through the disputed lands, there was now someone following them. Take he Amis with you. As with Osrith, who could ride faster than the embattled army, and the Morma, who had been on watch the night before, rubbed his weary eyes. Look for me, Eswy, he asked the captain. That is someone coming our way? Eswy brought his horse about, and looked south. The white horse was bright in the early morning sunlight. Unmistakable, he told him. I do not think it is Osrith, he added, answering his own question in his mind. We halt, cried Engus, and, looking across to Phelim, at the end of their line, called, across. Immediately, the horsed warriors formed a barrier with their foot soldiers between them. Swords were raised, because now, it was clear, that there was indeed a rider approaching them, but that he, too, was armed. And he slowed. At the barrier, which had done its job, the white horse skipped on the spot as the rider brought its reins towards him, and it reared at the speed at which it had had to slow. The rider brought the horse around on the spot. Then what is it you want? Eswy asked, in English, and then tried in Cymric. There was a slight triple in the left flank of the foot soldiers, for he used several choice swear words when he spoke in the Stratclydian language, and a few warriors laughed. Little had they had to liven their days since the battle at Wittenberg. "It is one person who rides with you, Finan," for it was indeed he who had caught up with them, addressed Eswi in Gaelish. "I seek that person." Beside Eswi, Engus broke the line and rode out past the captain, his sword still raised. He noticed a second sword at the man's hip. Why would a man be riding with two swords? "Irish bastard," Engus called. "Who are you to demand my men?" He turned in his saddle. "Is there any Irish here who recognizes this cunt?" Several people laughed. Finan said nothing, but held fast in his own saddle. But he did not lower his sword. "Is she here?" Finan asked, speaking in Gaelish still, and then lowered his sword, replacing it in his scabbard, and withdrew the other. In the bright morning's sunlight Bué sat happily in his hand. She left behind her sword. Engus peered forward, then looked across to Eswi. "Osrith," he clarified, carring through the posturing. "She rode north. Is she with you? Has she gone on to your king's fortress?" Finan's eyes were bright, his heart open. His heart was vulnerable. So many instincts made him want to ride away, or pull the bastard Morma from his horse and skewering him into the heathland. "I am here to fulfill an oath I once made to her," he added, and at this, looked at Eswi. Finan had often seen the man at her side, leaning in as they discussed strategy, as they discussed warfare. He was to whom Osrith looked in the army of Alba. "We are not far from the fortress of Dunnottar," Eswi told Finan of the Alate, and lowered his sword. "It is better you come with us." "And bring her sword." 88,888,888. And so, in the fated fortress of which Finan had long heard, of its formidability, of its size and might, all of which was true, Finan thought, as he rode his mount at the back of the officers as they crossed the plain before it. Here, many Norse had been slaughtered under Mac Corsten Ui Alpin, Constantine's father, including the fabled Ivar the Boneless. It was galling, but Domnall was able to establish rule here and unite the kingdoms. Unlike Irian, or so Finan had heard, where the Uí Empire had begun to fail on the death of Flan Sinna. Norse had returned and were pressing Neil Glundube, Don Shada Mac Flan, and whoever was ruling his own father's land. "Wait here," Engus told him, allowing his horse to be stabled, and threw himself onto the stone cobbles that was Dunnottar's courtyard. Eswi walked by him, glancing to Finan, who also relieved his horse of its burden, and stood where it had once stood, in the courtyard, within the rampart. The gate closed behind him and in front. And there he stood. As the day wore on, Finan stood there, waiting for his audience with the king, as the sun rose to its highest zenith, before beginning its slow descent over the castle's granulations. Eventually Eswi came out. "I should take the sword," Eswi told Finan, approaching their warrior, but Finan gripped Bué's hilt and gave Eswi a stern look. "I will return this to Osrith herself," he told her. But Eswi shook his head. "I fear we have led you astray," Eswi told him. "Osrith has returned to the lands that she has farmed back down the coast at Berwick, as a widow." The look on Finan's face told Constantine's spy that this was not news to the warrior. The opposite, in fact. That was why he was here. "The king has asked me to bear to you his refreshment and that you should wait in the hall to speak to him." And Finan followed Eswi across the courtyard, where Osrith had once torn, pursued by Constantine, where warriors had assembled time after time to defend their land, where Domnall, in his madness, had risen from his bed at the call of the Sigh and had died in the cold one winter's morning. Now the mortal enemy of the Aelch, an unallied warrior, was crossing the threshold into the Uí Alpin fortress. It seemed like an age before Constantine came into the hall. Dressed in his blue cloak and his crown, he walked like Flan Sinna walked, as if the ground was lucky to have its feet upon him. Beside him was his son, Selark. Finan smiled. He knew Selark, for he had been given up as hostage twice, once to Alfred and the second to Edward. Both times Utad brokered the arrangement and both times it was Utad who had let him go. He nodded to Finan. "Selark, I thank you for coming with me to confirm the identity of this man," Constantine told his son. his eyes never leaving Finan's face. "Please, leave us. I am sure Edra has things she wishes to discuss with you." "Of course, at her," Selarch said to Constantine, and bowed his head. All was right and proper, they were before a guest, of course. "It is a fine day," Constantine said to Finan, as he walked across the stones of the hall. "But I sense, warrior, this is not why you have come to see me. So tell me, why have you come?" He beckoned to Finan, and added, "Walk beside me." If Finan had no time for this absurd show of kingliness from the man who had grown from the young, disrespectful pup he had known, he did not show it. Instead, he strode to be beside Constantine and walked with him along the passageway and into the courtyard. They headed across it and out through the postern gate into the land beyond Dunnottar before Constantine bade Finan speak. "I am of your house," Finan told him. "Yet you wear your hair short," Constantine replied, as Bright Meadow crunched dryly underfoot. "What was your disgrace?" "I betrayed my kin, Lord King," Finan replied. "And your kin are?" "Shadowkin Chapter of the Alate." He broke off, biting at the words. They were still bitter with him, and he sensed that King Constantine knew that and was enjoying his discomfort. "I know the Alate," Constantine interrupted, "and yet, you call me lord." "Your line of Atildilpin and mine are the same," Finan continued, with difficulty. Politics was not his strength. Of Demangert. "There is much for us to discuss." Finan M tilde cubed armac sign A tilde inverted exclamation mark L, Constantine replied, and stopped walking, the forest behind, where Osrith killed the Norseman providing a glorious summer backdrop, if either men cared to notice. "You come here in search Osrith Ui Alpin? Because her husband is dead?" Again, the words were painful, but Finan managed a "yes." "And you have the consent of her brother?" Finan nodded. "I do." Then there was silence. Constantine walked the perimeter of Dunnottar, and then arrived, with Finan to his left, at the front of the fortress. "We were here when she bowled over to me, sword in hand, facing down two Norsemen," Constantine told Finan, at last. "I was watching her. It was inevitable she would be killed, but she wasn't and chased me, defended me. I have cared for that woman since she was that girl, who stood before my father, who could make me tremble at a look, and promised to fight for him. She was 12. Constantine shook his head. "Look what she was fleeing, Bibbenberg, and her uncle." "Fear gives you courage. She learned that young." Finan had said nothing, instead went back into his own thoughts. She was clearly not at the fortress, or she would have come out to see him, or else tell him to go away. "I take it she knows everything about you," Constantine went on. "Everything," Finan agreed, touching his sword's hilt, "and then Osrith's." "Including your part in your attack on her on the coast?" They had followed her backwards and forwards between Doir and the coast. Connell had stolen her sword, Fedor sword, Finan remembered, carrying it right up until Eofuic. Osrith had sliced off his finger. So they had attacked what they thought was a shit-faced Gaelish boy who turned out to be a girl. He had held her down like Connell had attacked her. Finan had done nothing when his big brother had stripped her naked. He had tied her to the rock to drown. He remembered the witchcraft, and his brother's assertion that by drowning the witch the sun would return. Connell had fled, but he, Finan, had watched Domnall Macht, the dead king's son, wading out into the blue-green sea and lift her head high out of the water, diving into the water to untie her bonds and then take her in his arms and carefully wrap her in his cloak. Constantine had looked on, too petrified to do anything. Finan had run, then, and had seen that Constantine had done the same. How strange it is that within 2 years he would be on the same slave ship as Ethne, Domhnall's sister. She had been a child. How often he had lain there, looking at her, inches from him, not believing all that had happened since he had met Utad. Then, Finan told Constantine about the confrontation before Nine Fingers. "I slew him, at Eofuic, and Osrith helped me drive my sword into his gut. We were bonded, then." Constantine mused, then looked at Finan. She loves you right enough, and I think you were bonded long before Eofuic." He nodded his head. as if it were the first time he had heard that piece of information when indeed, Eswe and Angus had told him everything. And were it not for her brother slaying my cousin, she would be an Alpin not an Aelch. That was a big admission. The Uaid had owned all of the Ui Neil territory before Neil of the Nine Hostages grew the Ui Neil house, and pushed the Uaid to the north, and east, of the territory, where they faced the worst of the Norse raids and settlements. That Constantine had admitted Finan's family were the legitimate ones was a big deal, not that Finan was in a position to capitalize on that information. Constantine continued to walk, on the grass in front of Dunnottar, heading towards the ferry between there and the Culdees monastery. Here is my proposal. I will agree that she continue to work the land at Berwick, as a bulwark between Alba and Northumbria, fitting don't you think? Finan said nothing. I give you my consent, as her kinsman, for you to marry. And Finan prompted, his heart soaring in any case. Your son remains in my care. And then he told him of the final condition. It was serious, gravely serious. Dammuted, to put that idea in his head, Finan thought, yet he saw his own kin in young Finan, in the boy who he had met by the Tyne River, who had stood next to his mother and spoken so brightly to him. Yes, your grace, Finan told King Constantine, changing the course of all of their lives with just a few words, I agree. 88,888,888 saying it was dead. Lurid, morose thoughts clouded Osrith's mind that morning, as it did every morning. Flashes, scenes of her entering Bibbenberg, and trying to reason with Wea crowded in. She got up, and climbed to the top of the farm hall, sitting on the thatch. From there, Osrith could see the monastery on Lindisfarne, and to the west, further away, Bibbenberg. She looked away. That hated place, it hurt her eyes just to see it. The cows have been milked and fed and the sheep are up in the hills, Caltigar told Osrith when he came to the hall door that morning. Thank you, she told him, and nodded to the cook, who was making some sort of broth on the fire. Nodding, the young man stepped into the threshold, and received a bowl, steaming from the cooking pot, and a carved spoon with which to eat it. Berwick. The world turned, the seasons plodded on. Jobs were needed to be done. Berwick was the dream Osrith never knew she wanted. She had given it a chance, and had worked the land. It was only after abandoning it that she knew in her heart it would have been perfect for their future. She could have farmed barley, with her son at her side, listened to one of the alewives about varieties that were once grown hereabouts and acceded to her request to brew the local beer. Osrith put down the distaff next to her holy knitting attempt. No one had ever shown her how to do these things. She had made herself a warrior. A girl or two could come from the estate and do them, keep them for all Osrith cared, and stared out of the window. Now, Sainid's body in a corpse pile and, no doubt, a pyre beneath Bibbenberg's reclaimed walls. At least she had silver enough for Constantine, which she had thrust into Eswe's hand before she had ridden away, 2 days before. Although Edra was now 18. She had shown no inclination to marry even though she liked Anlaf. Osrith would have to keep her still until the girl decided what she would do. And when, a week later, a summons came, from a rider who clearly had come in haste. She tore open the seal and looked across the words. It is from the king, for you to come to Dunnottar, the young messenger said. Then Constantine need not have bothered to write down what he wanted me to know if you were going to put it out. Osrith scorned, thrusting the letter into her jerkin and turned her back on the man. Are you not going to answer the king? The messenger demanded, his tone a little sharper than he intended. He closed his mouth when he saw Osrith was holding Tag's seeks before her. I am a farmer, and if he wants to speak to me he can come here. And with that, Osrith turned, waving a hand in the messenger's direction as a means of dismissing him, before throwing the door closed behind her. Then, with her back to it, she pulled the letter from her clothing, scanning the words, before fueling the kitchen fire with it. Constantine had summoned her Dunnottar. She would not be going,